Welcome to ESD School, brought to you by Attract. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single episode. Enjoy the video.
So, thank you to be here. We will do a different episode from usual. We will go into a case of ESD in the colon and try to escape from this case with a lot of key points that are, I think, very important to deal with this kind of lesion. So first, what is the case? It is a patient of 72 years old with atrial fibrillation. It means with anticoagulant drugs. It's a lesion which is in the right colon, around 4 centimeters, because it's 1/2 of the colon, one hemicircumference, those are usually around 4 centimeters. And this lesion is somewhere in between the right angle and the valvula. So what are the strategic points? You should know all these points to schedule your procedure and to choose everything for planning your procedure. First, the patient, the age, the comorbidities, the history of abdominal surgeries, and if possible, if you have some information about the previous colonoscopies. Was it easy? Was it difficult? Was it a nightmare with a lot of loops? Or is it quite easy? About the physician now. Which scope do you have? Which channel? Which retroflexion power is available? What are your experience? Which part of ESD school are you working now? I mean, is it for you a high experience of colonic ESD, or is it one of the first cases in the colon? What are your preferences about strategy, and what is your usual perfect strategy? What is your favorite strategy? I mean, everything in underwater, everything with traction when it helps. Finally, which type of knife? Is it a needle type knife or a knife with an insulated tip knife? And finally, the lesion. What is the size? Which organ? Which location? Is there any fibrosis to attend? I mean, history of colitis, history of previous resection. Do you have pictures of the lesion? And what is your characterization? And first, we will see all these points to choose our perfect strategy. The first key point for me is, who am I? In which settings? I mean, what is the experience of the people, of the physician, and of the center? It means, what is your number of cases? What is your usual practice of ESD? Is it stomach, rectum, esophagus? What is your usual speed in terms of square millimeter per minute? What is your perforation rate? And do you have any experience and training in the difficult conditions? It means fibrosis, angles, valvula, etc. It is a very important point. And the second one is, what is your unit organization? Are you working in a team like National Cancer Center, for example, in Tokyo, where you have 10 people doing ESD in the center if you have a problem, if you need help, if you want to do a small break into your resection? What is the possibility to schedule the time slot? Do you have time to do this ESD? Should you take more time and reschedule the patient? All these points are very important to stay into the procedure without creating a nightmare in the unit. The second key point is, what are your weapons available? Which kind of scope do you have? Do you have therapeutic scope with very short bending? Do you need a more stiff device to go into the CCOM, for example? What is the brand you are usually using? Will you have RDI, for example, for bleeding management? Have you CO2 inflator, which is absolutely needed for such a resection by ESD? What is your electrosurgical unit and the settings? Do you have one flushing pump, 2 flushing pumps, or 3 flushing pumps, depending on your strategy and underwater strategy, for example, where 3 pumps are very good? Do you have anything to fix the pedal? Which kind of knife are you using? Which injection solution? And which traction device? And what is your experience with the traction device you have in the unit? Which scope for which ESD? What is important in this case is to have a good scope for diagnosis, because we will see there is a strange area in this lesion. We will see it just later. So you will need a good scope for diagnosis, to have chromoendoscopy and if possible zoom. And for therapeutic, you will have to choose something which is with a good retroflexion, a short radial bending, relatively soft, a 6-hour channel if possible, a 3.2 mm channel, which is my favorite, but you can have different favorites, and a oriented flushing to wash the area which is bleeding. Sometimes you will have to choose a compromise between softness and stiffness with adaptative rigidity, for example, in order to have a scope which is able to go in the right column without looping, without a good maneuverability, because maneuverability is probably more important in the right column than retroflexion power, and therefore you should choose the compromise to get a good maneuverability in the right column, even if your retroflexion power is a little bad or less important than with a therapeutic scope. And therefore, for me, I use therapeutic colonoscope with very good bending in the rectum, in the left colon, the descending colon, but for the right colon, I tried to use a compromise. For example, in Olympus scopes, the PCF 190L, which is something more stiff than the therapeutic scope, allowing to work relatively well with good maneuverability in the right colon. The difficulty of the lesion. The size is very important because duration of the procedure is directly linked to the size of the lesion. The location is very important. Keep in mind that angles are horrible, appendix is horrible, ileocecal valve is horrible, very small area like sigmoid colon are more difficult. If you have diverticulas in this area, it will be difficult. Fibrosis is sometimes a nightmare. IBD is very frequently more difficult. And there are other points like obesity, hernia, surgical history, maneuverability from the guy who did the colonoscopy before, and last point, the pictures to have a precise evaluation of the lesion and its histology. This lesion was very interesting because you had, on the first picture we received, a red area, which was really not like the remaining part of the lesion. And when we injected on the oral edge, it was a small cancer of 1 centimeter around with a pattern which was almost destroyed, 5N of Kudo and Sano 3B, but on very small area. So in our classification called Connect, we describe it as a Connect 2C lesion, which is a borderline cancer with an area of red or green sign with amorphous pattern, but of less than 10 millimeter, which is sometimes associated with a borderline T1 cancer that can be cured by ESD. And for these cases, we do diagnostic ESD to obtain a sample histologically and decide the further management. The fourth key point is the maneuverability. It's very, very important for right colon lesions. Sometimes a lesion that appears very difficult will be in fact relatively easy because the maneuverability is perfect, lie in the rectum. and sometimes a small lesion of 15 millimeter that is a good indication for ESD because of the pattern or something, will become a nightmare because the scope is not movable at all. So what is very, very important is to have a good maneuverability, and for this you should try to do the shortening technique described by Japanese colleagues in order to try to shorten every angles and avoid looping. If you do the loops, if you should try to remove the loops by delooping in order to get your very good colonoscopy around 80 centimeter at the C-com with a good transmission of the scope movement, which make your ESD far more easy. And for this, to do the shortening technique very well, underwater insertion with water exchange is probably the best option to reach the C-com with a good maneuverability. Fifth key point is the strategic planning. I mean, you will try a priori to schedule your procedure. You will anticipate because of the pictures you received, because of the location, the size, everything. Then you will do your colonoscopy and adapt yourself to the maneuverability. On-site evaluation will help you to decide the good strategy for this lesion. And after, most important probably, is adaptation. Because in fact, it will be very difficult to anticipate every part of the procedure. You will have a planning, but every time you will have to adjust your planning to what is the answer of the tissue, the bleeding, the gravity change during the procedure to adapt yourself. Each case is particular, and these are some examples of my usual planning for a lesion. For example, in ascending colon, I spend a lot of time doing the colonoscopy to have better maneuverability and stability. And as soon as I get this maneuverability, I try to have a perfect exposure thanks to a good traction device. For the ascending colon, for example. For the right angle, it's very difficult, so I schedule a large time slot and adapt myself with retroflexion, traction to change the shape of the angle everywhere. For the anal verge, I'll begin by the anal incision. All my a priori strategy are here, but after we will try to adjust. And after, we will try to have the perfect ESD during the procedure. I mean, we will do the helpful injection to help your strategy, an effective incision, an effective trimming, an effective dissection, a traction, which help a lot, adverse events preparation, and oncological knowledge after the resection. First, the helping injection with the most beautiful mountain of the world, in my opinion, which is one of the volcanoes of Auvergne in the center of France. It's a good shape to understand what we want. It's very difficult to enter the tissue for doing the incision at the top of the mountain. It's better when the mountain is facing you. And if you want to know more, please see the episode about the injection in the ESD school. The most difficult injection is to inject in a fold, in a downhill, because it's very difficult with the down wheel to go into the tissue and have a deep incision. After, you will try to do an helping incision. In this case, if you inject at the anal side of the lesion will turn, and it will become very difficult to do the oral edge incision. So, for me, in this lesion, you should inject first outside the lesion, at the oral side, to turn the lesion to face you, and therefore to have an incision which is really more easy, by doing first the incision at the oral edge, making the mucosa growing to you, turning the lesion facing you, and therefore you will have a more effective incision in direct viewing. If you are able to do it with retroflexion, it's even better. Incision and trimming, how to do the best submucosal access. You should do it everywhere around the lesion, homogeneously, everywhere at the same depth, with margins relatively large to fix the traction, a good depth, facilitating your procedure, and with a good mucosal exposure. And I invite you to see the episode about incision and trimming in the ESD school if it's not clear. The incision should use the small dot of Yahagi, because Yahagi described it for me when I was in Japan, but it's very important to reach the submucosal layer by doing a small dot, and therefore you will move from this dot in order to have a good depth during your incision. If you begin to move before reaching the good layer, you will have to repeat several times the incision. But if you do a small hole, relatively deep, you repeat to be sure to be in the blue. You inject to be sure you have reached the blue layer, and therefore you will begin to move at the good depth with the tip of the needle in the good depth. So small dot and moving. Once again, it is described very precisely in the incision episode. After, you should target a smile shape because it will help you to have a good entrance into the submucosa. The mouth shape with a smile which is later open thanks to your trimming will make the access to the submucosa easier. You should target a round shape because if you do a round shape, all the force vectors are trying to reduce the lesion to the center of the piece, and it will make the opening of the space easier. Also, if you do it with many different directions, you will have a very difficult ESD. When it is possible in the right colon, it's better to do your incision in retroflex position when it's possible, because you will not do an incision on the opposite wall, but you will begin the dissection of the lesion you want to remove. So when it's feasible, do it in retroflexion. When it's too difficult or too dangerous because the colon is too small, you should probably do it by direct viewing. How to get the best submucosal dissection? It should be deep enough, because in the deeper part of the submucosa you have less vessels, but without perforation. You will expose better the vessels when you do it deep. It will remove the mucosal flap, and the traction will help a lot to remove the mucosal cap. Instead of getting it on your field of view, you will remove it and improve exposure. And finally, you should inject it very well and very properly. Turn the patient when the gravity could help your ESD, and you can do it from the beginning, but sometimes the problem will appear only during the ESD. Expose the vessel and try to be deep enough, because the vessels are dividing themselves at the surface, and it's easier to control the different vessels relatively deep, close to the muscle, because it's easier in fact to coagulate the trunk instead of coagulating all the small branches of the vessel, but you can see it on the episode about vessels. The vessels have a shape of chandelier like this, and therefore once again you should probably expose your vessel, prepare the vessel on the two sides in order to have enough space to coagulate the vessels on the right and on the left, instead of doing it directly with the tip of the knife. You should coagulate with the lateral side of the blade, which are more effective to get a good coagulation in this relatively large trunk, and prepare the space in order to have a way to control the bleeding if it begins to bleed a lot. And even for this relatively large vessel, it's feasible to do it without using a coagrasper. Then nothing without traction in my way of doing ESD, because it will increase your speed by tracting all the mucosa on the opposite side and by contracting all the submucosa, and therefore when you tract the submucosa to the opposite side, you have more density of fibers by unit of surface, and therefore each spike of the knife will cut more fibers. The small video to explain why only one traction is not enough, and usually you have a benefit to use a multipolar traction. When you use the multipolar traction, the space will reduce when the rubber band is decreasing in force, but by having an adaptive traction, you will be able to increase again this traction and achieve your resection quite quickly. And finally, my standard strategy will be oral injection, incision in retroflexion if possible. There I will fix the attract device on the oral edge. Then I will do my anal injection, do my incision, fix the device of traction on the oral edge and the two loops on the lateral edges. And finally, you will have this result. It's not the same lesion, but it was a similar lesion with an area of pattern which was quite difficult. I did first the oral incision, introduce the device of traction, fix the first point on the oral edge where the incision was completely done with trimming. Therefore, I did my anal incision with a relatively deep incision from the beginning. Once it's done, I fix the device on the oral edge, on the anal edge for the second part, and on the two sides to have a kind of four polar traction on the two edges and on the two sides of the lesion. You will have a first traction thanks to this 4-point traction to the center. It will expose the margins of the lesion, facilitating the trimming and the access to the submucosa. And either now or either a little later, I will fix the rubber band to the opposite wall in order to get a real 90-degree, if possible, countertraction to open the space and increase the speed of the resection by exposing better the submucosa. So we use conventional clip, and once you have this traction fixed to the opposite wall, you can see that the exposure is better, and that because the fibers of submucosa are stretched to the opposite wall, you will have a better speed because everything is condensated. And when the traction is going down, because the rubber band is less stretched, we will tighten the device in order to increase its traction and achieve the resection thanks to this strong traction that try to remove the lesion to the opposite side. So once again, even if it's not easy to place, it is really helpful once you are under the lesion. The adverse events management is very important. You should be prepared to manage the adverse events like bleeding during the procedure. And for me, at least, RDI is a very good way to reduce the stress because when it's not red, it's not so stressful, for me at least, and it makes more precise in randomized trial to control the bleeding. So it's a good way. You should be aware that perforation can happen sometimes in very unattended location, like here, for example. I didn't expect double perforation in this case. It doesn't happen so much in my experience to have a perforation because of the small hole to inject better, but it's not catastrophic. You should achieve your incision, do your trimming, dissect a little in order to open the space, and when the holes are far from the area you want to dissect, you have to put a clip to close the area of perforation without preventing the end of your resection. So please be aware that perforation will come and you should be prepared, trying to open the space before closing the defect, because if you close before doing ESD, it will be very difficult to achieve the resection. And finally, after the resection, you are still in charge of the patient, and in the case we presented, you have a small cancer here. It was a 1001 microns invasion with a deep margin of 750 microns. At this point, we could think that resection can be considered curative with this kind of deep submucosal invasion, which is relatively small compared to the threshold. But in this case, the budding was significant with a grade 2 budding, and finally the patient was sent for surgery. So finally, it was a lesion of the right colon with anticoagulant. We choose a colonoscope with good stiffness to be relatively well placed and with a good maneuverability in the right colon. We did underwater insertion with compression. We checked this area of connect to C lesion. We had a good retroflexion, but finally we prefer to work on direct viewing with an oral edge injection. We did the oral edge incision and then the anal edge injection and the anal edge incision. We placed the traction device, Attract, with adaptive traction. We did the bleeding prevention during the procedure, and finally this patient was treated with a R0 resection without perforation, despite the fact that budding made the resection non-curative. So this has all the points: ergonomy, choose the good scope, helpful injection, smile incision, good trimming, round shape, traction, bleeding prevention and detection, and perforation management are a lot of points we have developed in the ESD school to help you, because probably we should be prepared to improve our skills in all these different areas in order to get a better ESD procedure. Thank you very much. I hope it was a different way to give you our key points, and hope we will see each other very soon in ESG days. Best.
Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your colleagues. Until next time, this is ESD School by Attract.